John loved mornings. For him, mornings were the most peaceful time of the day, when the world was still half asleep and the lake in front of his house looked like a giant mirror, calm and still. He had been living in this lakeside home for almost 8 years, and the water was the main reason he had chosen this place. The gentle sound of waves brushing against the shore, the distant call of birds, and the way the sunlight danced on the surface of the water, it was something he never got tired of. Every weekend, especially Saturdays, he would make himself a cup of hot coffee, grab his old fishing rod, and walk down to the lake. That Saturday morning started no differently. The air was cool, and a thin mist floated above the water. John took a deep breath, smiling to himself as he felt the familiar crunch of gravel under his shoes. He reached the small wooden dock at the edge of his backyard, sat down on the old folding chair he kept there, and cast his fishing line into the water. It wasn't about catching fish for him. Sometimes he didn't catch anything at all. It was about the feeling, the stillness, the way time seemed to slow down when he was out there. He took a sip of his coffee, resting the cup on the dock beside him, and watched ripples spread out from where his line had landed. A few ducks floated by lazily, occasionally dipping their heads underwater. John smiled. Life felt good. About 15 minutes later, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. A woman in a bright pink jacket was walking toward him along the path that ran behind the houses. She was holding a clipboard in one hand and had an expression on her face that John had seen before, the expression of someone who wasn't there to enjoy the scenery, but to complain about something. Recognized her instantly. It was Karen Miller, one of the more enthusiastic members of the Homeowners Association. Karen was known around the neighborhood for 2 things: knowing every rule in the HOA handbook by heart and making sure everyone else followed them. If someone left their trash cans out a few hours too long, she'd notice. If a lawn wasn't perfectly trimmed, she'd send a notice. John usually ignored her, but she had never bothered him at the lake before. She approached with quick, determined steps, her sneakers crunching against the gravel. When she reached the dock, she didn't smile or say hello. Instead, she cleared her throat loudly, as if to get his attention, though he was already looking at her. "John," she said sharply, "do you realize you're breaking the rules?" John raised an eyebrow, still holding his fishing rod. Breaking the rules? What rules? Karen tapped her clipboard with her pen. HOA regulations. Section 14, subsection C. Fishing in the community lake is strictly prohibited without strict prior written permission from the Homeowners Association. John blinked at her, a little amused. "Karen, I've been fishing here for years. Nobody's ever said anything about this." "Well, now I'm saying something," she replied, her tone brisk. "As of last month's HOA meeting, it's been decided that fishing is to be regulated to protect the lake's ecosystem. You'll be receiving a $200 fine in the mail for this violation." John let out a small laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd. A fine? For fishing? This is ridiculous. I live right here. I've never harmed the lake. Just sit and fish quietly. How is that a problem? Kieran didn't seem moved by his words. "Rules are rules, John. They apply to everyone, whether you agree with them or not." John set his fishing rod down beside him, leaning back in his chair. "Karen, I think you're mistaken. I've read the HOA rules before, and I don't recall anything about fishing being banned. And even if it's a new rule, nobody informed me. Should have attended the meeting," she shot back. "It was all discussed and voted on." John shook his head slowly. "Right? The same meeting where people argue for 45 minutes about the color of someone's front door?" Karen narrowed her eyes at him, but didn't respond to that. Instead, she scribbled something on her clipboard. "We'll get the fine notice soon. I'm just doing my job here." With that, she turned on her heel and started walking away, her ponytail swinging behind her. John sat there for a moment, staring at the water. The peacefulness he had felt earlier was gone, replaced by irritation. He had dealt with annoying HOA rules before, but this was too much. He wasn't out here throwing loud parties or damaging property. He was fishing, quietly, on a Saturday morning, He reeled in his line, packed up his things, and walked back to the house. By the time he closed his back door, he could feel the anger simmering. It wasn't about the $200, though he wasn't about to pay it. It was about principle. This lake had always been part of his life here. When he bought the house, it was one of the selling points. And now, suddenly, the HOA was acting like it owned the water. Over the next few days, John couldn't stop thinking about it. Sure enough, a letter arrived in his mailbox 3 days later. It was official looking, printed on HOA letterhead, stating that he owed $200 for violating community rules by engaging in unauthorized fishing. The letter also warned that non-payment could result in additional penalties. John crumpled the letter in his hand. He had no intention of paying. Instead, he decided to find out exactly what gave them the right to fine him in the first place. He opened his laptop, logged into the county's public property record system, and started searching. As he clicked through documents, he felt a strange mix of curiosity and determination. He wanted to see who actually owned the lake. Was it really part of the HOA's property, or was this just another case of them overstepping? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that if they were wrong, this could be his chance to push back, not just for himself, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had ever been bullied by HOA rules. John's fingers tapped against the desk as he stared at the county records website on his laptop. The room was quiet except for the hum of his computer's fan and the occasional chirp of birds outside the window, at a cup of coffee beside him, but it had already gone cold. He wasn't focused on drinking it. His mind was too busy thinking about the ridiculous fine and the smug look on Karen's face when she had delivered the news. For years, he had believed the lake was part of the community, just like the walking trails and the small playground down the street. That's what everyone assumed. But now, with the HOA claiming authority to control fishing, John wanted to see exactly what the paperwork said. He started by typing in his address, which brought up details of his property boundaries. His backyard stretched right to the edge of the water, but technically, the lake itself wasn't listed as part of his lot. That wasn't surprising, he'd expected that much. Then he searched for the parcel number of the lake area. It took a few tries, clicking through confusing maps and layers of property lines. Finally, the screen showed the outline of the lake and some surrounding land. The owner's name popped up, Lakeview Development Company. John frowned. That wasn't the name of the HOA. He clicked for more details. The records showed that Lakeview Development Company had purchased the lake and the land around it more than 25 years ago, back when the neighborhood was first being built. But then he noticed something interesting. The company's status was marked as inactive. He dug deeper, scrolling through old filings and legal notes. It turned out that the company had dissolved nearly 10 years ago. That raised a big question in John's mind. If the company no longer existed, who actually owned the lake now? He looked through the chain of ownership, reading every line carefully. That's when he spotted a small but important note. Property available for purchase due to unpaid taxes. His heart skipped. The lake wasn't just unclaimed by the HOA, it was essentially up for sale through the county. He sat back in his chair, letting that sink in. The HOA had been acting like they controlled the lake, but legally, they didn't. They had no more right to dictate fishing rules than any random stranger did. And if he wanted to, he could buy the lake himself. The thought hit him like a spark. At first it sounded crazy. Who buys a whole lake? But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He loved the water. He'd always wanted to have more control over it, maybe even make improvements like adding a small dock or cleaning up the shoreline. And the idea of taking that power away from the HOA, well, that was just the cherry on top. Before doing anything else, John decided to confirm the details in person. The next morning, he drove to the county courthouse. It was a large brick building with tall columns and the smell of polished wood in the air. The records office was on the second floor, where rows of file cabinets stood against the walls and a few clerks sat at desks helping people with property questions. A woman with short gray hair greeted him at the counter. "Can I help you, sir?" "Yes," John said, placing his notepad on the counter. "I'm looking for information about a property, specifically the lake in the Lakeview neighborhood." She nodded and typed quickly on her computer. "Arsile." John handed her the one he had written down. She clicked through several screens, then looked up at him. Well, it looks like the owner of record was Lakeview Development Company, but that business dissolved. The property has been sitting in limbo for some time. According to our files, it's eligible for a tax sale. How much are we talking about? John asked. The woman glanced at her screen again. It's listed at $35,000. John's eyebrows rose. $35,000 for an entire lake and the land around it? That was far less than he had imagined. Of course, he'd still need to cover some legal fees and the taxes owed. It was nowhere near the millions people might assume a lake would cost. He thanked the clerk and left the building, his mind buzzing. By the time he got home, he had already decided what to do. He would buy it. It's not just to fish whenever he wanted, but to send the HOA a very clear message. They couldn't push him around anymore. That evening, he called a local real estate lawyer he knew from a previous property issue. The lawyer's name was Michael, a straightforward guy who didn't waste words. John explained the situation in detail, the fishing fine, the dissolved company, the lake being for sale. Michael chuckled when John told him about the HOA fine. So they think they own it, huh? This could be fun. Yes, it's perfectly legal for you to buy the property if it's in a tax sale. Once you own it, you can set whatever rules you like, as long as they don't violate environmental laws. Next week was a whirlwind of paperwork. John met with Michael twice to go over contracts, payments, and title transfers. He paid the required amount to the county, cleared the back taxes, and signed the final documents. Every time he put his signature on a page, he felt a mix of excitement and satisfaction. This wasn't just a purchase, it was a quiet victory. All the while the HOA had no idea what was happening. Karen had even waved at him smugly one morning while he was taking out his trash, probably thinking the fine was settled or that he had decided to stop fishing. John kept his expression neutral, not giving away a single hint. One evening, a week before the final transfer was official, John sat out on his back porch watching the sunset over the water. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, and the lake reflected every shade like a giant piece of glass. He imagined what it would feel like knowing it was his, every inch of it. He could fish, kayak, swim, or just sit and watch the water without anyone telling him otherwise. But more than that, he thought about the day the HOA would find out. He pictured their faces when they realized they couldn't boss him around anymore, not when it came to the lake. It made him smile to himself, almost like a kid with a secret. By the end of that month, the purchase was finalized. John was now the legal owner of the lake and the land surrounding it. The deed had his name on it in bold letters, was official, and the HOA had no clue what was coming. The envelope with the property deed sat in the middle of John's kitchen table like a quiet trophy. It's the thick paper, the official stamps, the bold letters stating his full legal name as the owner, all of it felt unreal. He ran his fingers over the document again, not because he needed to check it, but because he enjoyed the feeling. This wasn't just a piece of paper. This was power. This was freedom. It had taken weeks of quiet effort, but now it was done. The lake outside his house, the same lake where he'd been told he couldn't fish without permission, belonged to him. Every square foot of water, every inch of shoreline. The HOA hadn't even seen it coming. John leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee. It tasted better that morning, maybe because victory had its own flavor. He could already imagine the conversation when he finally told them. Part of him wanted to march straight to the next HOA meeting, slam the deed on the table, and watch their smug faces crumble. But another part of him, the bigger part, wanted to wait. Let them keep thinking they had control for just a little longer. The surprise would be sweeter that way. For now, he decided to keep the news to himself. Even his closest neighbors didn't know. Some of them would probably cheer him on, but others might run straight to the HOA. No, this had to be handled carefully. That afternoon, John walked down to the lake. It was a warm, breezy day, and the water rippled gently under the sunlight. He stood at the edge for a moment, taking it all in. Technically, he could do whatever he wanted here now. If he wanted to set up a big barbecue pit, he could. Wanted to install a private dock, he could. If he wanted to ban every single resident from stepping foot near the water, he could. He chuckled to himself at the thought. Residents not welcome. The phrase popped into his head almost instantly, and he liked the sound of it. He'd have to make signs, big ones, so there was no confusion. But not yet. Not until the timing was perfect. In the meantime, he started making small plans. He called a friend of his named Dave, who worked in landscaping, and asked for recommendations on shoreline maintenance. He also looked into a few fishing pier designs online, bookmarking the ones he liked. He didn't need to rush the lake. Wasn't going anywhere, but he enjoyed picturing what it could become under his ownership. The funny thing was, the HOA still acted like they were in charge. Just a few days after he signed the final papers, he got another letter from them. Not about fishing this time, but about unauthorized lawn decorations. Apparently, the small birdhouse in his yard was not in compliance with community aesthetic standards. John laughed out loud when he read it. Here they were nitpicking about birdhouses while the biggest thing in the neighborhood had just changed hands without them even knowing. Karen, of course, was still patrolling the streets like nothing had happened. One afternoon, as John was unloading groceries from his car, she walked by and gave him a polite but pointed look. "Hope you've been staying out of trouble," she said, her voice carrying that tone of fake sweetness she often used. "I've been doing just fine," John replied with a smile that was more genuine than she realized. She kept walking, probably thinking she had scared him into submission. John watched her go, shaking his head. If only she knew. A week later, John decided it was time to get the signs made. He didn't want something small that could be ignored. He wanted them big, bold, and impossible to miss. He drove to a local print shop and worked with the owner to design them. White background, black block letters, and a clear message. Private property residents, not welcome, no fishing. He ordered 8 of them, each 3 feet wide, printed on heavy-duty, weatherproof material. The shop owner, friendly man in his 50s, raised an eyebrow when he saw the text. "Sounds like you've got some troublemakers to deal with." "You could say that," John replied with a grin. The signs would be ready in a week, which gave him time to prepare. He called his lawyer, Michael, to double-check the legal side of things. Michael assured him that as long as the signs were placed on his property and clearly marked the boundary, he was within his rights to enforce them. John spent the next few days in a strangely good mood. Even when the HOA sent out another community-wide email about new parking restrictions, he didn't feel annoyed like before. It was almost amusing now, watching them act like the rulers of the neighborhood, while having no clue that their crown jewel, the lake, had slipped right out of their hands. Finally, the day came to pick up the signs. The shop owner helped him load them into the back of his truck, and John drove home with a feeling of satisfaction that was hard to describe. He parked by his house, grabbed the first sign, and walked down to the water's edge. The lake was calm that morning, the sky clear and bright. John planted the first sign at the main path entrance, securing it deep into the ground. From there, he moved around the shoreline, placing each sign where it would be most visible, near walking trails. By the dock, at the edges of the grassy areas where kids sometimes played. By the time he was done, the message was loud and clear. This was no longer the community's lake. John stepped back and looked at his work. 8 big signs, each one bold and unmistakable. He could already imagine the ripple effect this would cause once people started noticing. Some would be shocked, others would be angry. HOA would definitely lose its mind, and John, he was ready for all of it. That evening, as the sun set, John sat on his porch with a cold drink, watching the golden light reflect off the water. He thought about the first time he'd been told he couldn't fish there, the way Karen had stood with her clipboard acting like she owned the place. Now, it was his. And soon, everyone would know. The next morning was quiet, almost too quiet. John woke up earlier than usual, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stepped out onto his porch. The air was cool, and the lake shimmered under the soft light of dawn. The signs stood like silent guards around the water, their bold black letters sharp and clear, even from a distance. Perfect. He sat down with his coffee, knowing it was only a matter of time before someone noticed. It didn't take long. Around 7 o'clock, while John was still sipping from his mug, he saw an older man walking his dog along the path that looped around part of the lake. The man stopped suddenly, leaning forward to read one of the signs. His dog tugged impatiently at the leash, but the man stayed frozen for a few moments, staring as if he wasn't sure he was reading it correctly. Then he straightened, looked around like he expected someone to explain, and walked off quickly, pulling out his phone. John chuckled to himself. He could guess exactly who the man would call. By 9 o'clock, the quiet was gone. From his porch, John could see small groups of neighbors gathered near different points of the lake, all pointing at the signs. Some of them looked confused, some irritated, and others downright furious. A few younger kids ran up to the signs, reading them out loud before their parents called them back. At 9:30, John's phone rang. The caller ID said HOA office. He let it ring. At 9:42, it rang again. This time it was Karen's number. Again, he ignored it. By 10 o'clock, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find 3 people standing there: Karen, the HOA president, and another board member he barely knew. All 3 wore serious expressions, though Karen's face had a hint of panic in it. "John, we need to talk," the HOA president, a tall man named Greg, said firmly. "About what?" John asked innocently, leaning on the doorframe. Karen gestured toward the lake. "About those ridiculous signs you put up. Can't just claim the lake as your private property. It belongs to the community." John smiled slightly, enjoying this moment. "Actually, it doesn't. Not anymore. Would you like to see the deed?" The 3 of them exchanged looks. Greg frowned. "What are you talking about?" Without a word, John went inside and returned with the envelope. He opened it slowly, deliberately, handed them the official document showing his name listed as the legal owner of the lake and surrounding land. The silence that followed was delicious. Karen's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak, but couldn't find the words. Greg scanned the paper twice, his eyebrows climbing higher each time. The 3rd board member just stared at John as if trying to decide whether this was a joke. This can't be right," Karen finally said. The HOA never owned the lake," John interrupted calmly. "It was owned by a development company that dissolved years ago. The county put it up for sale, and I bought it. Simple as that." Greg looked at the deed again, clearly realizing there was no loophole to grab onto. "So you're telling me the community has no rights to the lake anymore?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," John said. "Which means your fishing rules, your fines, all of that means nothing. Like, this is private property now." "My property?" Karen's face turned red. "This is outrageous. You can't just keep people from enjoying the lake. We've been using it for years." John shrugged. "I've been fishing here for years, until you tried to fine me for it. Consider this a natural consequence." The 3 of them stood there for another moment, clearly struggling to process the situation. Finally, Greg handed the deed back. "We'll be in touch," he said stiffly, and they turned to leave. Within an hour, the news had spread through the entire neighborhood. The HOA sent out a mass email to all residents, claiming there had been a misunderstanding and that they were exploring legal options regarding the lake. But John knew they didn't have a case. The property records were clear. His lawyer had already confirmed there was no way for the HOA to reclaim ownership unless he willingly sold it. And that was never going to happen. That afternoon, more neighbors came by, some to ask questions, others to vent their frustration. A few were friendly about it, admitting they didn't like the HOA's fishing ban either, and secretly found John's move amusing. But others were angry, insisting that the lake belonged to everyone and accusing him of being selfish. One man even shouted at him from across the street, calling him the guy who ruined the neighborhood. John just smiled and waved. By evening, the lake area looked different. There were no kids playing near the shore, no people walking right up to the water. The signs had done their job. Everyone knew where the boundaries were now. John decided to go fishing. He grabbed his rod, walked down to the dock, and cast his line into the calm water. He could feel eyes on him from across the street, people watching from their porches or peeking out from behind curtains. But nobody said a word. Nobody dared. As he sat there, the sun dipping lower in the sky, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about proving that he didn't have to be pushed around. that he could stand up to people who thought they had power over him. When he packed up for the night, he walked past one of the signs and patted it lightly. "Good work today," he muttered with a grin. Over the next few days, the HOA's tone shifted. Their emails became more aggressive, filled with warnings about community, harmony, and neighborly behavior. They tried to imply that John's actions were damaging property values, that he was dividing the neighborhood. But John didn't care. He had the law on his side, and the lake was his. Of course, the tension in the air was impossible to miss. People who used to wave now avoided eye contact. Some gave him dirty looks as he drove by. But there were also quiet supporters, neighbors, who slipped him a thumbs up or whispered "good for you" when nobody else was around. One evening, as John sat on his porch, Dave the landscaper stopped by. "Heard you stirred up a hornet's." "Ness," Dave said with a grin. "You could say that," John replied. Dave laughed. "Oh, well, I think it's about time someone put the HOA in their place. Need any help keeping the lake looking nice?" John considered it for a moment. "Maybe. But for now, I'm just enjoying the peace and quiet." And he was. For the first time in years, the lake truly felt like his sanctuary, a place where he could sit, fish, and think without interference. Every time he saw one of those signs, he felt a little jolt of satisfaction. The HOA had tried to take something from him, and instead, he'd taken something from them that they could never get back. The best part, he still couldn't quite believe it had happened. Weeks passed, and the uproar slowly began to fade. At first, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip every single day. People would stop on the sidewalk to point at the signs, whisper to each other, and glance toward John's house as if they were trying to catch him doing something suspicious. The HOA kept sending out their long, carefully worded emails, always hinting that they were looking into solutions, but never actually saying what those solutions might be. But as time went on, the excitement turned into something else: acceptance. People realized that no matter how many angry conversations they had at HOA meetings, no matter how many letters they sent to the board, nothing was going to change. The lake was gone from their control, and it wasn't coming back. For John, life felt different now. In a good way. Every morning, he woke up, made his coffee, and looked out the window at the calm water. He no longer had to think about whether someone might walk up with a clipboard and a fake smile to tell him what he could or couldn't do. He didn't need permission. He didn't need to follow a set of lake rules written by people who had no real authority. Sometimes he went fishing just because he could, even if he wasn't in the mood. Other times, he sat by the shore with a folding chair, a book in hand, letting the soft breeze and the gentle sound of the water wash over him. It wasn't just about the fishing anymore. It was about knowing the space was truly his. Not shared, not borrowed, but owned. The HOA tried one last time to challenge him. About a month after the signs went up, he got a letter from their lawyer. It was written in heavy legal language, full of phrases like community access rights and historical usage precedent. But when John's lawyer, Michael, read it, he actually laughed. "This is nothing," Michael told him over the phone. "They're trying to scare you, but they don't have a legal leg to stand on. The property is yours. The records are clean. If they want to fight this in court, they'll just be wasting money, and they know it." That was the last real attempt the HOA made to get the lake back. From then on, their emails and newsletters stopped mentioning it entirely, as if ignoring the problem would make it disappear. But the signs stayed, and the reality was impossible to hide. John noticed how the behavior around the lake changed. Families who used to set up picnics by the shore stayed away now. People who once walked their dogs right to the water's edge kept to the paths instead. Teenagers who had once thrown rocks into the water or tried to sneak in for late-night swims didn't bother anymore. The area was quieter than it had ever been. One evening, just as the sun was setting and the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, John sat on his dock with his fishing rod. The water was calm, reflecting the colors of the sky like a giant mirror. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not the loud, triumphant kind, but a quiet, steady one. The kind you get when you know you've won, and nothing can take that away from you. A neighbor named Tom, who lived a few houses down, walked over and stopped at the edge of the dock. Mind if I join you? He asked. John looked at him for a moment. He hadn't seen Tom much since the signs went up, but Tom had never been rude or confrontational. He was one of the quiet types. Sure, John said, nodding toward the other chair. They sat in silence for a while, lines cast into the water. Eventually, Tom spoke. I think what you did was kind of brilliant, he admitted. I mean, sure, some people are mad, but honestly, the HOA has been out of control for years. You just gave them a taste of their own medicine. John smiled faintly. That wasn't my main goal. I just wanted to fish in peace. But yeah, I guess it worked out that way. Tom chuckled. You might have made a few enemies, but you also made a lot of secret fans. John didn't respond to that, but he knew it was true. Not everyone in the neighborhood was angry with him. Some people even thanked him quietly, saying they wished they had the courage to stand up to the HOA like that. Over the next few months, John began making small improvements to the lake area. He hired Dave to help clean up parts of the shoreline, trimming overgrown plants and removing debris. He repaired his dock, added a couple of benches, and even built a small storage shed for his fishing gear. Everything was done at his pace, exactly the way he wanted it, with no one telling him to fill out forms or wait for approval. The lake began to look better than it had in years, but it remained private. The signs stayed in place, a reminder that this was no longer a public space. Occasionally someone would test the boundaries, usually a kid trying to sneak in for a swim, but John would walk down, point at the signs, and tell them politely but firmly to leave. Most people didn't argue. One afternoon, as he was sitting outside reading, Karen herself walked by. She didn't say a word, just gave him a long, cold glare before continuing down the path. John couldn't help but smile.
Ow.
For all her bluster, for all her rules and fines and HOA authority, she had been completely powerless to stop him. The truth was, he hadn't just won the fight over the lake. He had changed the way he saw the entire HOA. They weren't all powerful. They weren't untouchable. They were just a group of neighbors with a set of rules. Rules that only mattered if people let them matter. By the time summer rolled around, the neighborhood had fully adjusted. The lake was simply John's lake now. People mentioned it in passing the way you might mention someone's garden or someone's driveway. The shock and outrage were gone. Life had moved on. For John, that was the best outcome he could have hoped for. No more drama, no more HOA interference, just him, his lake, and the quiet peace he'd always wanted. Every so often he'd think back to the morning when Karen had walked up to him with that clipboard ready to fine him for fishing. It was almost funny now. It's how that one small act of pettiness had set everything in motion. If she hadn't tried to push him around, he never would have looked into the property records, never would have discovered the lake was for sale. He never would have bought it. In a strange way, the whole thing had been her doing. Sometimes, as he sat on the dock watching the sun dip below the horizon, John would take a slow breath and feel a deep gratitude, not toward the HOA, of course, but toward himself. For not backing down, for not letting someone else decide what he could and couldn't do on a piece of water that had always been part of his life. He didn't need applause. He didn't care if some people still didn't like him. He had his lake, his fishing, and his freedom. And in the end, that was all that mattered.